Today on History's Prototypes, we are going to be looking at the failed attempt to replace the M4 Sherman. This series of tanks, starting off with the medium tank T20, later on the 22, 23, and 25, were designed to be the Sherman tank's successor. And after a series of trials and going through multiple design and development issues, the plan would ultimately be abandoned. However, it would eventually produce a true successor, the M26 Pershing. But let's go ahead and look at the failed series of tanks that were supposed to be the M4 Sherman successor. Now, I've previously talked about the story of the M4 Sherman, everything that it went through, design issues, problems, things like that, to become one of the most mass-produced tanks for the Allies. However, what I really haven't talked into detail about is what happened immediately after the M4 Sherman was standardized. Now, essentially what happened is, even though the tank was adopted, it was pushed out to the United States Army and the USS Allies, there were those within the U.S. Ordnance Department that, while they thought it was a decent tank, they wanted something more. And so they went ahead and pushed plans to develop a successor tank for this new production tank already. Now, the British had actually started working on their own infantry tank using M4 parts. Known as both the assault tank T14 and the T14 heavy tank, this was actually a joint venture between the United States and the UK, basically to produce a universal infantry tank, utilizing American parts, British design. They were going to create this new kind of combination tank. Now, what ends up happening is the Churchill tank ends up getting produced, and the British don't like it, so the whole project gets abandoned. And the United States' Ordnance Department goes ahead and continues work on their own Sherman successor. Now, when developing the Sherman successor, they had a few specifications. They needed it to be about 32 short tons. It needed an automatic 75 millimeter gun, 4 inches of armor plating, and a top speed of 25 miles per hour. Now, starting with the T20, the Ordnance Department decided to go and develop 3 different series of medium tank prototypes, the T20, 22, and 23. Now, essentially the difference between these 3 different types of tanks is the choice of transmission. The T20 uses a torque converter fluid drive transmission, the T22 a 5-speed mechanical drive transmission, similar to what the M4 already had in it, and the T23 uses an electric drive transmission. Now, they all moved the transmission to the rear of the vehicle, which basically eliminated the need for a drive shaft running the length of the vehicle, essentially simplifying the design, making it a bit easier on the vehicle, easier to mechanically repair, not as many moving parts to be damaged, that kind of a thing. Also, the drive shaft that was used in the M3 and later M4 basically forced them to mount the turret much higher, which increased the vehicle's height, which means that it has a higher profile, which means it sticks out more when being attacked by an enemy tank. Now, for the T20, they only built 2 of the tanks. The initial T20 with a 76 millimeter gun. There were plans for several variants, including the T20E1, which would have that 75 millimeter automatic gun that they were developing. The T20E2 would have had a 3-inch gun. And then the T20E3 was actually built. But the big issues with the T20 was that the transmissions leaked. They overheated real easily, and basically because they weren't really much of an improvement, they abandoned it. Now, at the same time they were making the T20, they were working on the T22. Now, the T22, exact same engine. Of course, I talked about they had a different transmission. They, too, just like the T20, the T22 had multiple variants. You had the initial T22 that was created, the T22E1, which was essentially a refitted T22 that was utilizing a new turret, and it actually got that 75 millimeter automatic turret and a horizontal volute spring suspension. Now, they had plans to go ahead and throw that 3-inch gun that they wanted to put on the T20 on this as well, but they ended up stopping with this. Now, just like with the T20, this one was abandoned. The T22 was abandoned basically because when they tried that automatic gun, it wasn't any better. The whole tank was unreliable, and larger caliber guns were a bigger priority anyway, so they basically abandoned the T22. Now, the T23 was the final one of the 3 that was being developed. Now, the T23, again, very similar setup except a different transmission, and it had a new suspension. Now, as with the T20 and the T22, the T23 had multiple pilot vehicles, as they call them, which are the initial prototypes to be made. Now, while the T23 ended up having several of its variants canceled, just like the 20 and the 22, it was found to be much more maneuverable, had better speed, better performance, and the Army actually liked it. And they decided to go ahead and further its production design. So they went with a limited procurement. They made 250 of these tanks. And while the tank was never utilized as a frontline vehicle, it was used in multiple testing of different weapons configurations, and it did continue in its development until it would ultimately be found to be an inferior replacement for the M4 Sherman. Now, with the rejection of all these tanks, it was decided to go ahead and come up with a new prototype based on all of these designs, what worked, what didn't work, kind of go through that. And that's where we get the T25 medium tank. Now, the T25 incorporated the idea that they had come up with that much larger calibers were needed. So they went ahead and attached a 90 millimeter gun onto this chassis. Now, 40 test vehicles were ordered to kind of figure out what worked and didn't work on this. Many of them were actually modified versions of the T23. However, this still lacked what they were looking for in terms of armor. So a different variant based on the T25, known as the T26, was pushed ahead. This would become the M26 Pershing. And the M26 is considered by the Army to be the Sherman's true successor, even though it came a little bit too late to actually be utilized in World War II. That tank would go on to service throughout the early days of the Cold War. But there you have it, a look at the multiple attempts to basically build 3 different tanks at one time, all designed to replace the Sherman tank, each one with their own flaws. The only semi-successful one being the T23, which inspired the T25, which later helped make the T26, which gave us the M26 Pershing. But that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you on the next time.